The letter came folded inside an envelope with a silver embossed logo that read, Silver Pines Homeowners Association. It looked official enough to be a property tax notice, but the contents made my hands tighten around the paper before I finished reading the first paragraph. They were demanding I remove my boat, an old aluminum skiff that had belonged to my grandfather, from my lake, not suggesting, not requesting, demanding, within 48 hours, or I'd face a $500 per day fine. They had even tacked on a warning that the HOA would arrange towing at my expense if I didn't comply. There was something almost theatrical about the audacity. I had moved to this lake for peace. Serenity, the simplicity of living beside water that had raised 3 generations of my family. And yet here was a group of board members with clipboards and a warped sense of authority trying to dictate what could float on water that didn't belong to them. What struck me more than the threat was the arrogance behind it. Silver Pines wasn't even a particularly old community, barely a decade since they broke ground on the first of their prefabricated McMansions. My grandfather's name was carved into one of the boulders along the northern ridge. The cabin he built stood firm on a foundation older than any bylaws these people had ever written. They had been using my lake year after year for their fishing derbies, wine-tasting cruises, and summer paddleboard yoga sessions, all without asking permission or acknowledging ownership. And now they were trying to tell me that my boat weathered lovingly, patched. A floating piece of my family's history was non-compliant with aesthetic standards. I wasn't angry. Not at first. I was amused. Bemused even. These people had clearly gotten too comfortable playing landlord on someone else's property. They must have assumed the lake was forgotten, that whoever held the deed wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. But I noticed, and I cared deeply. What they didn't understand yet, what they were about to learn the hard way, was that I didn't just inherit land. I inherited responsibility. And if they thought they could push me around, they hadn't read the part of the story where the quiet guy turns out to be the storm. After rereading the letter, twice, I folded it neatly, slid it under my coffee mug, and stepped outside onto the deck that overlooked the lake. The morning mist hadn't fully lifted yet, and the water was calm, unaware of the storm that was brewing on its shores. My grandfather's boat bobbed gently against the dock, the same dock I helped him repair. The summer I turned 12. That boat had hauled more bass than I could count, and more memories than I could measure. I wasn't about to let it be towed away like some unregistered junk. That afternoon, I drove into the county records office where the clerk, an older man named Hal, still remembered my grandfather's name. He helped me pull the deed, the water rights paperwork, the surveyor maps from back when the lake was first parceled. There was no ambiguity. My ownership included the lake bed itself and a buffer of land 30 feet from the high water line which neatly swallowed the picnic benches, volleyball nets, and even the community kayak rack that had mysteriously appeared on my shore years ago. The HOA didn't just lack authority. They were full-on trespassing. By the next morning, I had security cameras installed at strategic points mounted to trees aimed at the dock, the trailhead, even the bend where HOA guests liked to set up sun umbrellas. Every motion was logged, every visitor caught on tape, and the cameras weren't hidden. I wanted them seen. I wanted the message clear. This lake was watched now. Then I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Emma Caldwell. She and I had met back in college, both studying environmental science before I veered off into logistics software, and she went full bore into land use law. Now she ran her own legal practice and had made a name taking on overreaching HOAs. When I told her what was happening, she didn't even hesitate. "You're not just dealing with entitlement," she said. "You're dealing with a group that's built an entire illusion around control. And illusions don't break gently." Her words stuck with me. I didn't want conflict, but I wasn't going to be erased from land. My grandfather built with his hands. I had no intention of becoming the next quiet casualty in their long list of people too tired or too scared to fight back. Emma arrived 2 days later, her car still dusty from the highway and her briefcase already open before she made it through the door. We spread the documents out across my dining table: deeds maps, tax records, and even a faded black and white photo of my grandfather holding up a catfish bigger than a toddler. That table, once used for cleaning fish and playing cards, became a war room. Emma combed through the paperwork like a surgeon with a scalpel, cross-referencing boundary lines and access easements. It didn't take her long to confirm what we already knew. Legally, morally, historically, this was my land. The lake wasn't community property. It wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. It was private, period. What alarmed her, though, were the patterns. She noticed how HOA event flyers used phrases like "our lake" and "community shoreline" for years. She spotted how their digital records scrubbed any mention of private ownership, and how their bylaws quietly shifted language around lake management responsibilities. It wasn't a mistake. It was a campaign. While Emma worked the legal angle, I handled the cameras. The first week yielded exactly what we needed: footage of HOA members hosting yoga classes on my dock, families launching kayaks, and even one couple dragging a folding bar cart down the slope to host sunset cocktails by the lake, all on my property, all without permission. Then came the kicker. The HOA's website proudly displayed photos from a recent community fishing classic, complete with tents, music, and catered food, all positioned exactly where my eastern trail met the lake. My logo, burned into a bench I'd built myself, was visible in the background. They weren't just trespassing. They were commodifying my land. That's when Emma decided it was time to go quiet. No confrontation. No cease and desist yet. We would build a wall of documentation so airtight that when the hammer dropped, there'd be no wiggle room. No claims of confusion. No pleas for misunderstanding. "They've lived off borrowed authority for too long," she said. "Now we're going to show them what real ownership looks like." The plan was simple. Let them keep walking into the trap. Let the next violation come. And it did sooner than expected. The next morning, I found a fresh neon orange notice zip-tied to my gate. This one wasn't about the boat. It accused me of non-compliant landscaping, citing unauthorized fencing materials, and obstruction of community access. My jaw clenched as I read the nonsense. They were escalating not with legal facts, but with petty intimidation. What made it surreal was the line that read, "You are in violation of Section 12A of the Clear Ridge Community Guidelines, which prohibit exclusive structures that restrict access to shared amenities." Shared amenities. That's what they were calling my land now. My jaw tightened. It was no longer just about flexing control. It was about rewriting reality. And they were getting bold. I didn't respond. I printed out the latest violation and added it to the growing binder. Emma had labeled HOA overreach exhibits A through Z. Then I checked the cameras. Sure enough, I caught two HOA board members pacing the fence line the night before, flashlights in hand, peering through, like burglars casing a target. One of them I recognized from the last meeting, Karen Mitchell, the vice president. The other was a wiry man with glasses and a clipboard, probably their compliance officer. They weren't lost. They were scouting Emma, and I decided it was time to prepare the counteroffensive. We drafted a letter, not to the HOA, but to the entire Clear Ridge community. It was clear, respectful, and backed by irrefutable facts. I enclosed deed copies, legal citations, even a timeline of events showing how long the HOA had used my land without permission. I hand-delivered each envelope to every mailbox outside the gates of the neighborhood. Then we waited. Within days, I started getting visitors, not from the board, but from the residents. A man in his 60s thanked me for standing up. A young mom asked if her kids could still fish from the dock, just like they used to when your grandfather was around. A teenage boy said he'd thought the lake was public and was shocked to find out otherwise. The tides were turning quietly, steadily, and the HOA, they had no idea a storm was brewing. It wasn't long before the HOA realized they were losing control, not just over the lake, but over the narrative. Their next move was desperate and obvious. A sleek flyer appeared in every mailbox inside Clear Ridge, complete with a glossy photo of the lake at sunset, overlaid with the words, "Preserving Our Heritage. Support HOA. Authority to maintain." Lake Harmony. Below that, in smaller print, were bullet points laced with distortion claims that private ownership endangered safety, that new fences were barriers to community unity, and that legal intervention was actively threatening property values. I nearly laughed. The hypocrisy was blinding. Emma didn't laugh. She got to work. We drafted a formal cease and desist letter citing false representation and defamation addressed not only to the HOA board, but to the third-party marketing firm they had hired for the flyer campaign. We made it clear, if they continued mischaracterizing the lake's ownership, they would face legal consequences. At the same time, I reached out to a small environmental education group I'd once volunteered with during my brief escape from tech life. They were enthusiastic about bringing programs to the lake. Within a week, we organized a community eco-day birdwatching tours, fishing education, and native plant restoration for kids and families. Flyers went up across town. To my surprise, families from Clear Ridge came, some cautiously, others with sincere curiosity. No fences barred them. No patrols turned them away. They walked the restored trails, asked questions, watched their children release tadpoles into shallow pools. I spoke to every person who approached me, explaining not just the ownership, but the why I fought, why the lake mattered. That afternoon did more than legal documents ever could. It reminded people what mattered: connection, stewardship, honesty, not HOA, politics, and the board. They tried to shut it down, filed a noise complaint, sent another violation notice. But by then, it was too late, because that night, a resident of Clear Ridge, an older man with a quiet voice and tired eyes, sent me an email with one sentence that told me everything had changed. They don't speak for us anymore. That message from the Clear Ridge resident stuck with me for days. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than any threat the HOA had thrown my way. It was the first crack in their foundation, a quiet admission from within that their power wasn't as absolute as they claimed Emma ever. The strategist said it best as we sipped coffee on the cabin porch. 2 mornings later, they're losing the narrative. Now we press the advantage. We didn't launch a lawsuit, not yet. Instead, we let their own tactics betray them. More flyers came out this time, warning residents about private surveillance and hostile landowners, but their tone was frantic now, unfocused. At the same time, a few sympathetic residents began sending me copies of HOA, meeting notes, and internal emails. Some even attended meetings with voice recorders. That's how we got the smoking gun. One recording revealed a board meeting where Richard Wilkins himself admitted they had no legal ownership of the lake, but were establishing behavioral precedent in hopes of eventually negotiating control or forcing a sale. He called it long-game acquisition through community dominance. Those were his exact words. Emma's eyes lit up when we heard it. "That's not just manipulation," she said. "That's malice, a forethought." We sent a copy of the recording, anonymized, to Sarah Lynn, the journalist. She didn't hesitate. Within 48 hours, a scathing article hit the front page of the local paper. "Power grab at Clear Ridge HOA. Caught plotting takeover of private lake." It featured quotes from the leaked meeting side by side with the property deed and aerial maps showing the legal boundaries. The fallout was swift and brutal. Residents flooded the HOA's email server with angry messages. A petition to recall the entire board was launched that same afternoon. Even the town's mayor weighed in publicly, calling the HOA's behavior a gross overstep with potential criminal implications. Wilkins didn't respond. He couldn't. He had vanished, literally overnight. The man who had bullied me about my boat, who had signed the violation notice taped to my property like some bureaucratic war flag, had packed his things and disappeared before the next HOA meeting. His kingdom of paper rules and empty threats collapsed with him. With Richard Wilkins gone, the Clear Ridge HOA staggered like a headless animal, still dangerous but bleeding power fast. Karen Mitchell, his second in command, stepped in as acting president, trying to stabilize the board. But it was too late for damage control. The community wasn't angry anymore. They were embarrassed. And that, as Emma reminded me, was always more dangerous. The next HOA meeting drew a full house. For the first time in years, residents who never attended before showed up with questions, documents, and in some cases, outright fury. I didn't go. I didn't need to. But several people sent me voice recordings and summaries afterward. Karen tried to steer the meeting toward healing, talking about unity and community values, but no one was buying it. One resident stood up and read aloud the leaked transcript of the board meeting where Wilkins laid out his plan to force me out. Another asked where their HOA dues had gone if the lake hadn't actually belonged to them. A third demanded to know how much had been spent on legal fees, trying to intimidate me. Karen had no answers, only platitudes. Half the board resigned by the end of the night. The very next morning, Emma and I received an email from a lawyer representing the newly restructured HOA. The tone was vastly different, measured. conciliatory, and polite. They acknowledged the court ruling affirming my ownership of the lake and requested a meeting to discuss possible collaboration opportunities regarding community access. We met at my cabin on my terms. The proposal they brought was simple and frankly reasonable. A seasonal permit program for lake access. HOA members who wished to fish or kayak could apply through a controlled process managed by a nonprofit. They agreed to pay a fixed annual amount, part of which would fund the Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, the rest going toward shoreline upkeep and environmental education programs for local schools. I took a few days to think it over, not because I doubted the plan, but because I wanted to make sure I wasn't accepting peace, just to feel like I'd won. In the end, I agreed because it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about restoring the lake to what it had always been, a shared treasure with firm boundaries and real respect. When the new agreement went into effect, that summer, things didn't change overnight, but they changed where it mattered. The tone, the culture, the way people walked up to the lake, not like they were entitled to it, but like they were grateful it was still there. We held a quiet ceremony beneath the old oak tree near the eastern shore, the one where my grandfather used to clean fish and tell stories about the big one that got away. Judge Michael Davis, the new HOA president, stood beside me as we installed a weathered wood sign carved with the words Stillwater Conservation Area in Stewardship, not ownership. I watched as the first group of students from the local high school arrived later that week. Part of an outdoor biology class Emma had helped organize. They waded into the shallows, collecting water samples and spotting tadpoles, while their teacher explained the lake's unique ecosystem. A few parents watched from the trail, snapping photos, smiling in the kind of quiet pride that only comes from seeing something healed instead of sold. The fishing tournaments eventually returned, but under strict terms: no alcohol, no sound systems, no marketing banners, just people and nature and the soft splash of lures hitting water. Even Gerald Thompson's old Elite Anglers Club, rebranded under a new name, and leadership this time opening their membership to anyone willing to take a course in conservation ethics. I was invited to speak at their first meeting. I politely declined. Some things are better left to new voices. Sarah Lynn, the reporter who had stuck with this story from beginning to end later, wrote a follow-up piece titled The Lake That Wouldn't Be Bought. It ran on the front page, again this time, framed not as a scandal, but as a rare win for common sense. And me. I took the boat out one morning not long after the permits were finalized. The sun was just creeping over the trees, mist curling off the surface like breath from the past. I brought my coffee, my grandfather's tackle box, and nothing else. No agenda, no anger, just the lake. The same lake that had waited for me to come home and reminded me that some things are only lost when you stop protecting them. Fall came slowly that year, like the world was in no hurry to let go of what we'd built. Leaves turned amber and drifted lazily across the lake's surface, gathering at the banks like old memories. For the first time in decades, Stillwater was quiet for the right reasons. Not because people had been pushed out, but because they had chosen to respect its rhythms. Word of what happened here traveled farther than I expected. A documentary crew from a regional PBS station reached out wanting to film a short feature about grassroots land stewardship. I wasn't sure at first, After all, I hadn't done this for attention. But when I saw the way they framed the story, focusing on legacy conservation and community repair, I agreed. They interviewed Ray under the oak tree, let Emma explain the legal twists, and even included a brief segment with Judge Davis, explaining how the HOA had changed its bylaws to prevent any future overreach. The piece aired under the title, Lines on a Map, The Fight for Stillwater. I watched it from my cabin with a blanket over my shoulders, the sound of crickets humming outside, and for once I felt peace without waiting for the other shoe to drop. But peace, I've learned, isn't passive. It's something you tend. It's planting signs before they're needed, not after the damage is done. It's meeting anger with facts, manipulation with paper trails, and greed with quiet, patient resistance. It's choosing to outlast rather than outshout. One morning, I received a letter not from a lawyer or a reporter, but from a kid in Ohio who had watched the PBS segment with his dad. He wrote to say he didn't know you could actually win against people in suits, that his family had lost their neighborhood park to a developer, and he wished they'd had someone like me. I didn't know what to write back at first. What do you say to a kid who's already seen something precious taken from him? Eventually, I wrote this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay. Stay when they expect you to leave. Stay when they count on your silence, and when it matters most, stand. Winter arrived, not with fury, but with grace. Thin ice glazing the lake each morning like a protective shell. Most days, I'd light the stove early and sip coffee on the porch, bundled in my grandfather's old flannel, the same one he used to wear when walking the shoreline, reminding me that stewardship wasn't seasonal, it was lifelong. Judge Davis and I continued our work with the Conservation Trust. We implemented new measures, quiet zones for nesting birds, invasive species, monitoring a rotating patrol schedule managed by volunteers. It became more than land management. It was education, empowerment, healing. What began as one man's boundary fight turned into a living framework for how a community could coexist with its environment and with each other. Meanwhile, the ripple effect stretched beyond Stillwater. Emma helped residents in 2 nearby counties challenge their own HOAs after discovering similar abuses. One group reclaimed access to a trailhead. Another halted a condo development planned on land designated as protected wetlands. Emma joked that we'd accidentally started a movement, and maybe she was right. As for the old HOA leadership, Richard Wilkins was still a ghost story, whispered about at council meetings. Karen Mitchell resigned quietly and moved out of state, her name now a cautionary tale for would-be opportunists. Their development firm, Lakeview Legacy Holdings, dissolved within 6 months of the court ruling, leaving behind a trail of lawsuits and unpaid debts. The new board at Clear Ridge eventually asked if they could install a commemorative marker at the trailhead that led to the shared shoreline. I approved it. On one condition, they had to include the original survey boundary and a note that read, "Maintained in partnership, protected by truth." There are still mornings when I catch myself watching the water too long, wondering how close we came to losing all of this. How many places had been lost because no one stood firm, and what might have happened if I'd ignored that first violation notice, shrugged, and walked away, but I didn't. And now when kids throw stones into the ice and parents teach them to skip across its surface, I know they're not just walking on water. They're walking on something earned.